Gavin Newsom flew to Washington to ask Donald Trump for $43 billion, but he walked out with just 12, and his presidential campaign in pieces. The White House pool camera recorded everything. 41 minutes. 3 questions Newsom couldn't answer. 1 number he couldn't explain. $24 billion of missing California money. Subscribe if you believe accountability still matters. Because this is exactly how the most polished Democrat in America lost his 2028 run in one Oval Office meeting. Mr. President, with respect, before we begin the formal request, I want to be clear about something. Governor Gavin Newsom sat on the Chesterfield chair beside the Oval Office fireplace. He was wearing a Brioni navy suit and the specific shade of blue tie that his media consultant in Sacramento had selected 3 days earlier. They detested 4 alternatives against the warm color temperature of the Oval Office television lighting. His hair, which had been cut the previous evening by a stylist flown from Los Angeles to his hotel at the Four Seasons Georgetown, was immaculate. 6 feet away, the President of the United States sat behind the resolute desk. That's the desk Theodore Roosevelt had converted from an antique gift of Queen Victoria. It's the desk where Franklin Roosevelt had signed the Declaration of War in 1941, and the desk beneath which John Kennedy's son had once hidden during White House photographs. Donald Trump wore a navy suit and a red tie. His hands were folded on top of a single, unopened folder. He didn't fidget. He didn't tap his fingers. He just watched Newsom begin. Mr. President, Californians didn't vote for you in either election. The people I represent believe this administration represents an existential threat to democratic norms, to the rule of law, and to the fundamental American project. I'm saying that, not to be provocative, but because the people of my state deserve honesty from their governor when he sits across from the President of the United States. Newsom leaned back slightly. It's the kind of lean back a man performs when he believes he's established moral ground before transacting business. He'd rehearsed the statement twice in his hotel suite the previous night. His chief of staff, Dana Williamson, who sat now along the wall beside 2 other Newsom aides, had advised him, "Governor, don't let him set the tone. You set it first. Remind him who you represent, then pivot to the ask." Newsom had pivoted. The ask was next. He expected Trump to respond to the opening statement with an insult, a nickname, or a theatrical interruption. He expected some version of the Trump that 7 years of political analysis on MSNBC and the New York Times opinion page had taught him to anticipate. He thought Trump was dangerous, but manageable, that Trump was a figure a governor could frame, counterpunch, and narrate against. Trump didn't respond. The silence that followed Newsom's statement was longer than Newsom had anticipated. It was long enough that the pool camera would show a small smile briefly form at the corner of Susie Wiles' mouth. She was the chief of staff, seated along the wall to Trump's right, and the smile was quickly controlled. Trump didn't offer a diplomatic reciprocation. He didn't say, "I appreciate your honesty, Governor." He didn't acknowledge the opening at all. He simply waited until Newsom had finished, waited another 4 seconds after that, and then spoke. "Governor." It was a statement, not a question. Newsom had come to ask for $43 billion, not 40. The exact figure Trump had offered was too close to be coincidental. Someone on Trump's staff had read California's formal request document before the governor walked into the building. "Yes, Mr. President, for disaster relief related to the January wildfires, I've got the documentation with me." "I know what you have with you, Governor." Trump didn't move to see the documents. He didn't gesture for them. His eyes didn't leave Newsom's face. "Before we discuss the $40 billion, I want to ask you one question I think the American people would like to hear the answer to." Newsom, who'd rehearsed 12 different Trump responses to his opening, hadn't rehearsed this particular turn. Of course, Mr. President, Trump opened the folder in front of him. He didn't remove a document, he simply opened the folder. Governor, where did the $24 billion go? The silence that followed the question wasn't tactical. It was actual. Governor Newsom had come to Washington with a 4-page memorandum of talking points folded into the inside pocket of his jacket. The memorandum had been drafted by a Stanford-trained policy writer and reviewed by 2 former Obama administration officials. It anticipated, by his senior staff's estimation, 94% of the likely questions Trump might ask. The memorandum hadn't anticipated this question. Mr. President, the $24 billion figure you cite is from your own state auditor, Governor. Trump continued, cutting into the silence. Grant Parks, your appointee. The figure reflects total California state expenditure on homelessness between 2019 and 2024. It's public. You haven't disputed it. I'm not citing a figure. I'm asking you a question about a figure you already know. Trump gestured without looking, and Susie Wiles slid a folder across the low table between the chairs. Newsom picked it up. The folder contained the California State Auditor Report 2024-12, the California Interagency Council on Homelessness findings, and documents from Newsom's own state government. Those are your documents, Governor, not mine. Read the first, highlighted paragraph. Newsom glanced down. He knew the paragraph. He'd known it for 2 years. Mr. President, the 2024 audit found that, read it, Governor, out loud, for the pool camera. A beat passed. Newsom read, the state lacks current information on the ongoing costs and outcomes of homelessness programs. Of the 5 programs evaluated, 3 have inadequate data infrastructure to determine whether the funds spent are producing any measurable result. Trump nodded slowly, pushing another document across. Read the next one. Newsom read, between 2019 and 2024, California's homeless population increased from approximately 134,000 to approximately 181,000 by federal HUD count and to approximately 350,000 by the state's own Continuum of Care Services count. Governor, the $24 billion was spent, Trump stated. The homeless population roughly doubled. Your own state auditor says no one knows where the money went. Is that accurate? Mr. President, the audit methodology. Newsom started. Yes or no, Governor? Newsom's hand, which had carried the memorandum in his inside pocket for the preceding 11 minutes, and which had been sweating into the memorandum the entire time, didn't reach for it. The memorandum had been written for a Trump who would insult him. The memorandum didn't have a paragraph for a Trump asking him to read his own audit aloud. The audit findings are accurate, Newsom conceded. Trump closed the folder in front of him. He didn't celebrate the concession. He didn't smile. He didn't use a nickname. He simply spoke in the even register of a contractor, explaining why the invoice would be paid. Governor, you flew here today to ask me for $40 billion. I'm asking where the last $24 billion went. Not for a partisan point. For a very simple administrative reason. If I sign this disaster declaration, and I'm a federal official, I have a fiduciary responsibility to the American taxpayer. I need to know that the state receiving the money can account for it. That's not political. That's basic. Newsom attempted the pivot his staff had rehearsed with him. Mr. President, disaster relief is distinct from homelessness spending. The Stafford Act specifies direct. Governor, I know what the Stafford Act specifies, Trump interrupted calmly. I signed 31 disaster declarations in my first term. I understand the law. Here's what isn't in the law. The law doesn't require me to ignore the state's track record on prior federal disbursements. And your track record, Governor, is documented in your own audit, by your own auditor, in your own state. Susie Wiles handed Trump a thicker folder. He didn't read from it. He slid it across the table. Governor, I want to be fair. I want you to see what my administration is seeing. These are internal communications from the California Department of Housing and Community Development. They were obtained through a federal-state data sharing agreement your own administration signed in March of 2023. Newsom opened the folder. The documents were on state letterhead. Page 12, Governor. Read it. Newsom read silently first. His eyes moved across the page twice. Then, after a pause that the pool camera would record as 7 seconds long, he read aloud. Home Key Round 4 allocations. 67% of funds dispersed to projects with no post-occupancy tracking. Verification of outcomes not required under current Memorandum of Understanding. Recommend continuing current disbursement structure to avoid administrative delay. That's your state housing department, Governor, not my administration, Trump pointed out. They re-instructing themselves in writing to not track outcomes because tracking outcomes would delay the disbursement. And the disbursement, apparently, is the point. Mr. President, the Home Key program is the program you called a national model, Newsom countered. Governor, I've read the press release. I've read the transcript from your press conference in Sacramento. National model, 16,000 units for 175,000 people. Do the math, Governor. That's 10 people per unit. Are they stacked? It was the first Trump moment of the meeting. It was the first flicker of the rally voice, the voice Newsom had prepared for. It lasted less than 3 seconds. Trump didn't pursue it. He let the question sit in the room, and then he moved past it, his voice returning to the even register of the deposition. Governor, the question I need answered before I can, in good conscience, put the federal government's full faith and credit behind a $40 billion disbursement to your state is this. Where did the $24 billion go, and how do I know this 41 follow the same path? Newsom's hand, which had been carrying the memorandum in his inside pocket for 15 years of California politics, moved. The memorandum was always different, but the hand's relationship to it was the same reach, the same retrieval, the same deployment. That hand moved for a moment toward the pocket and stopped. The memorandum was written for a different conversation. It was written for the Trump his advisors had described over the preceding week in sessions at the governor's residence in Sacramento. It was meant for the Trump of insult and narrative frame. The Trump, a skilled Democratic governor, could lecture from moral high ground and expect, at worst, an incoherent explosion that would play well on national television that evening. This Trump wasn't that Trump. This Trump had asked a procedural question. A budgetary question. It was the kind of question a Republican governor of Texas or a Democratic governor of New York would ask of any colleague requesting $40 billion without accountability for the previous 24. The memorandum in Newsom's pocket didn't answer this question because this wasn't the question Newsom had come prepared to be asked. The hand lowered back to his thigh. The memorandum stayed in his pocket. Trump waited 12 seconds. The Oval Office, which had absorbed worse silences in its history, absorbed this one without comment. Susie Wiles didn't write anything. The pool camera held on Newsom's face without cutting away. Governor, I'll ask again. Where did the $24 billion go? Newsom finally found the only answer he had. Mr. President, I'll provide my administration's full response in writing. Trump closed the folder in front of him a second time. Governor, that's not an answer. He didn't repeat the question a third time. He didn't need to. The pool camera had captured the non-answer. The White House stenographer, seated discreetly in the alcove beside the grandfather clock, had recorded it. The transcript, which would be declassified through routine FOIA procedure 9 weeks later, would read simply, Governor Newsom declined to provide a verbal response. Trump gestured to Wiles for a new folder. This one was slimmer, a single document. Governor, while we on the subject of accounting, I want to introduce one more item before we move on. This is from your administration/own interagency coordinator on homelessness, a woman named Dr. Elena Vasquez. She served in your Department of Housing and Community Development from June of 2021 through November of 2024. She resigned. Did you know her, Governor? Newsom's face didn't change, but his jaw worked once. Dr. Vasquez was a career civil servant. I didn't have direct working relationships with. Governor, that is fine. I don't need a relationship history, Trump interjected gently. I need you to hear her testimony. Because she submitted testimony to the Federal Review, my administration initiated in February of 2026, under oath, in writing. It's part of the federal record. I'm going to read one paragraph. He read from the page. I resigned in November of 2024 because I could no longer maintain professional integrity while working in the California Department of Housing and Community Development. I had over the preceding 18 months documented 23 separate instances in which home key disbursements were made without the completion of required verification protocols. When I raised these concerns through internal channels, I was told that verification protocols were subordinate to disbursement velocity. I was told this by my supervisor, who was told it by his supervisor, who was told it by the office of the governor. I've got the emails. They reattached. As Exhibit A to this declaration, Trump set the document down. Governor, Dr. Vasquez resigned because your office, the office of the governor, not my characterization. Her words instructed her to accelerate disbursements over verification. She has the emails. They reattached as an exhibit to a federal declaration. Do you contest the authenticity of Dr. Vasquez's testimony? Mr. President, I'm not familiar with the specific internal communications Dr. Vasquez references. Newsom deflected. My office handles thousands of personnel. Governor, I didn't ask if you were familiar. I asked if you contest the authenticity. Trump said firmly. Yes or no? Silence filled the room. 8 seconds this time. I'd need to review the specific documents, Newsom finally answered. Governor, you have 1 week to review them and contest their authenticity through federal channels, if you choose, Trump advised. Absent contestation, they become part of the federal record in the ongoing Inspector General review of California's use of federal emergency housing funds. Trump paused. Governor, Dr. Vasquez is one of your own people, a career civil servant, not a political appointee, not a Republican, not a person with a partisan motive. She resigned from your administration because, in her sworn words, she could no longer maintain professional integrity while working there. And you, in this room, can tell me whether you contest her testimony. Governor, when a career civil servant resigns from your administration because she believes your office is instructing her to violate verification protocols on federal funds, that isn't a press management problem. That's a governance problem. And I'm being asked today to give your governance $40 billion additional dollars. Newsom's knuckles, resting on the folder in front of him, tightened. Trump opened a different folder. These were older documents. The paper had the particular yellowed quality of photocopies from a microfilm archive. The font was smaller. One of the pages Newsom could see from across the table bore the masthead of the San Francisco Chronicle, Governor, I want to go back. Before the governorship, before California. To 2004, Trump began. You were the mayor of San Francisco. You were 36 years old. You made an announcement. Do you remember it? Mr. President, I'm not sure where this. Newsom hesitated. It was February of 2004, at City Hall in San Francisco. You stood at a podium, Trump recounted. You said, "And I have the transcript in front of me? It's on White House letterhead, because my staff retyped it from a 10-year-old press archive." Quote, "Within 10 years, homelessness in San Francisco will be eliminated. This is a solvable problem. It requires only political will and sustained investment. I will stake my reputation on it." End quote. Trump slid a document across the desk. It was the front page of the San Francisco Chronicle, dated February 12, 2004. It featured a photograph of a younger Newsom. The hair then, as it was now, perfect. Standing at a podium, the headline read, "Mayor pledges to end homelessness by 2014. Governor, you staked your reputation on it," Trump said. "Your words." "Yes, Mr. President, I did," Newsom acknowledged. In 2014, 10 years later, what was the San Francisco homeless population? Trump asked. "Governor, I was no longer mayor in 2014, Mr. President," Newsom clarified. "I'd been elected lieutenant governor of—" "That's not what I asked, Governor," Trump interrupted. "What was the population?" A pause followed. "Approximately 7,500, Newsom answered. "And what had the population been in 2004? "Governor, when you made the announcement?" Trump questioned. "Approximately 6,000, Newsom replied. Trump closed the folder. "Governor, you promised to eliminate it. 10 years later, it had grown by 25%. That isn't a partial success. That isn't a qualified failure. That is the opposite of what you promised. You staked your reputation on it, Governor. What happened to the reputation?" Newsom found his pivot. "Mr. President, homelessness is a complex issue that involves interlocking causes. Substance abuse, mental health policy, housing affordability, interstate migration patterns. No single executive, in 10 years or 50, has—" "Governor, it's a yes or no question," Trump cut in. "Did you accomplish what you staked your reputation on?" Silence fell. "No, Mr. President," Newsom conceded. Trump handed a new folder across the table. It was thinner, only 3 pages. "Governor, since you invoked complexity, I want to show you something," Trump said. "An internal memorandum from your chief of staff during your mayoral term, dated January 16, 2013, 1 year before the 10-year deadline you'd publicly committed to. It was provided to my transition team by a former member of your San Francisco administration, who has, since 2023, asked to remain anonymous. You may contest its authenticity in writing if you wish." Newsom opened the folder. His eyes moved across the first page. The recognition, when it arrived, wasn't on his face. It was in the stillness of his hand on the edge of the folder. The hand didn't turn the page. Trump read from his own copy, saving Newsom the requirement of reading it aloud. Memorandum to Mayor Newsom, via Gubernatorial Campaign Office. Subject 10-year pledge messaging strategy. Key paragraph, quote, "The 2004 pledge is unrecoverable. Homeless count has grown every measurable year of your mayoralty. Recommend strategic pivot. Stop citing the pledge publicly. Emphasize new programs with different metrics. Redirect media attention to state-level initiatives. If pressed on the 2004 commitment, frame it as aspirational rather than operational. Gubernatorial messaging should under any circumstances, reference the 10-year eliminate timeline." End quote. Trump set the document down. "Governor, in January of 2013, Your own staff told you the pledge you'd staked your reputation on was unrecoverable. They told you to stop citing it, to reframe it as aspirational, to redirect media attention. And you followed that advice. I've reviewed your public statements between January 2013 and your November 2018 gubernatorial election. You didn't, for the remainder of that period, reference the 2004 10-year pledge. Not once. He paused. Governor, you knew in 2013 that UD failed. Your staff told you in writing. And instead of telling the public, instead of standing at the same City Hall podium where you'd made the pledge and admitting the pledge wasn't kept, you redirected. You pivoted. You ran for lieutenant governor on a different platform. You ran for governor on a different platform. You ran a California Fair Political Practices Commission filing in 2017 that emphasized, and I'm quoting from your campaign disclosure, your record of innovation in cross-sectoral problem-solving. You didn't use the word homelessness. Not once in the entire document. Now you're here, Governor, asking me for $40 billion, and you want me to believe that this time will be different. What's changed, Governor? Trump pressed. What has changed in 22 years that would make this $40 billion different from the last $24 billion and different from the 2004 San Francisco pledge before that? Newsom didn't answer. The pool camera, which had been holding on him for 90 consecutive seconds by this point, captured a detail the wider shot would miss. The knuckles of Newsom's right hand, resting on the folder of the memorandum he'd just been made to confront, had turned white. It was the only part of his appearance that had changed in 41 minutes. The hair was perfect. The suit was perfect. The posture, to the inexpert eye, remained upright, but the knuckles had whitened and would remain white for the duration of the meeting. Gavin Newsom was 57 years old. He'd been a mayor, a lieutenant governor, a governor for nearly 7 years. He'd appeared on magazine covers, Time, Vanity Fair, GQ. He'd spoken at the Democratic National Convention. He debated Ron DeSantis on Fox News, and to the horror of his own advisers, but the delight of his base hadn't been destroyed. He was considered, in January of 2026, to be among the 3 most plausible Democratic presidential nominees for 2028. And possibly the most plausible, the hair had been, for most of his life, the most consistent and reliable political asset he possessed. The hair was perfect. The hair would remain perfect through the full duration of the Oval Office meeting. The hair would remain perfect for the drive to Reagan National Airport. The hair would remain perfect for the boarding of the California State plane. The hair, the Oval Office pool camera would later show, wasn't what he'd been betting on. What he'd been betting on was performance. He'd built a career on the ability to shape the narrative in the room, to control the cadence of a conversation, to redirect an unflattering line of questioning into a pivot that served his preferred frame. He'd been doing it since 1996, when, as a newly appointed member of the San Francisco Parking and Traffic Commission, he'd answered a question at his very first public meeting, a question about parking enforcement, with a 4-minute speech about urban design philosophy. Trump, at the resolute desk, wasn't allowing the pivot. Trump wasn't interrupting. Trump wasn't reacting. Trump was asking a question, allowing the pause, receiving the non-answer, and asking again. The rhythm, Newsom realized somewhere around the 3rd question about San Francisco, wasn't the rhythm of a political interview. It was the rhythm of a deposition. And the deposition was being conducted in the Oval Office. And the person conducting it was the man Newsom had spent a decade characterizing to California voters and to national Democratic primary audiences as a man incapable of sustained focus. The hair was perfect. The performance it had always rested upon was no longer operating. Trump opened a 3rd folder. Governor, I want to talk about the fires. The specific reason you're here in this room today. January through March of 2026. The fires that burned through Pacific Palisades, Altadena, Silmar, and 23 other zip codes across 4 California counties. The fires that resulted in 47 lost lives. The fires that destroyed 12,400 structures. The fires that produced the disaster request you brought with you today. Yes, Mr. President, Newsom confirmed. Governor, for the pool camera, on what date did you first visit the affected fire zones? Trump asked. A pause. Mr. President, my chief of staff can provide the exact. Governor, I'm asking you, do you remember the date? Trump interjected gently. A longer pause followed. I'd need to consult. January 17th, Governor Trump provided the answer. 9 days after the first fire started. 9 days after a state of emergency was declared. 9 days after the first casualties were reported. Trump slid a document across the desk. This is the flight log. From a private charter, your campaign operation retained from Landmark Aviation. Dates of January 9th through January 16th, 2026. Locations visited: New Hampshire, Iowa, South Carolina. Governor, you were running for President of the United States. While Pacific Palisades was burning, I was at the staging area in El Segundo on January 15th, Newsom defended. Your lieutenant governor was there. Your attorney general was there, Trump corrected. You were in Manchester, New Hampshire, at a fundraiser held at a private residence owned by Stephanie Tompkins. Newsom's face didn't change, but the silence extended. Mr. President, I was conducting official state business. The meetings in New Hampshire included discussions with the Democratic Governors Association about interstate emergency coordination protocols. Governor, I know the difference between state business and a presidential primary fundraiser. I've attended both, Trump stated plainly. The flight log, which is a public record filed with the FAA, documents your travel. The attendance list of the Tompkins event, which was covered by the Manchester Union Leader and the New Hampshire Journal, documents your presence. You were there, Governor, while they were burning. Trump handed over a thicker folder. Governor, I want to introduce a communication from CAL FIRE. It was forwarded to me by the California congressional delegation. Both parties signed the cover letter that accompanied it. The communication is from Chief Robert Morales, CAL FIRE Incident Commander assigned to the Pacific Palisades response, dated January 14th, 2026. 5 days into the fire, Chief Morales sent this email to your Chief of Staff. He slid the document across. Read the highlighted paragraph. Governor, Newsom read. Dana, I am writing because I can reach the governor's office through standard channels. We've been in containment operations for 6 days. Our personnel need to see the governor on the scene. The men and women of CAL FIRE have been losing their peers. 44 homes burned on Bienvenida yesterday. I wouldn't ordinarily write to you this way, but I've never, in 28 years of service, had a governor absent from the field this long during a major emergency incident. Please tell me when he's coming. Newsom placed the document down. Governor, a CAL FIRE incident commander with 28 years of service, wrote to your Chief of Staff because he couldn't reach you. Trump summarized. Because he'd never in his career seen a California governor absent this long during a massive fire. Your office response. I have the reply in the folder. Dated January 15th, 1 day before your New Hampshire event, was a communication from your Chief of Staff stating, and I'm quoting, "The governor is aware of the situation and sends his full support. His schedule doesn't permit an immediate visit." Trump emphasized the words, governor, his schedule, the men and women of CAL FIRE, firefighters, governor, not politicians. firefighters who were running into burning buildings while you were eating dinner in Manchester. They were losing their peers. And the communication from your office said his schedule. Newsom tried, for the first time in the meeting, a direct counterpunch. It was the moment his advisers had prepared him for. President, with respect, you were campaigning in 2020 during the pandemic. You held rallies during active outbreaks. You weren't on the ground in every affected state during the pandemic. I understand the political theater of visible absence, but governance requires attention across the entire state. Not just symbolic visibility at a single fire. Trump didn't interrupt. He allowed the counterpunch to finish. He nodded slowly when Newsom concluded. Governor, in 2020, I was President of the United States during a global pandemic, Trump replied. I was in the White House. I was in briefings. I wasn't eating dinner at a private fundraiser in New Hampshire while an American city burned. And Governor, more importantly, I'm not the one in this room asking you for $40 billion. You re-asking me? The question isn't what I did in 2020. The question is what you did in January of 2026. And in January of 2026, Governor, you weren't in California. You were running for president while your state was on fire. And now you in my Oval Office asking the federal government to cover the damage you didn't personally witness. Silence. The pool camera, which had continued to hold, captured the single involuntary action of the meeting. Governor Newsom's left hand rose to his jacket cuff. The cuff didn't require adjustment. The hand was moving because it had to move somewhere, and the cuff was what was available. The hand found the cuff, made a small adjustment that wasn't necessary, and lowered. The motion took less than 1 second. The pool camera captured it clearly. In the week that followed, that 1-second clip, which would be known in the Internet's compressed vocabulary simply as the cuff, would be viewed 143 million times across platforms. A behavioral psychology graduate student at UC Berkeley would publish a thread analyzing the micro-expression. The thread, as most shared sentence read, "This isn't nervousness. This is the precise moment a politician realizes that his strategy has ended. The hand moves because the mind doesn't know where else to put the body." Gavin Newsom didn't know, as his hand moved to the cuff, that it was being captured. He didn't know that this single gesture would be the frame used on the cover of the Sacramento Bee, the Los Angeles Times, and 45 other major American newspapers to illustrate the photograph that accompanied the story of his political end. He knew only that his arm had moved. He knew that Donald Trump hadn't interrupted. Trump hadn't theatrically dismissed his counterpunch. He hadn't produced a nickname or a rally insult. Donald Trump had simply waited, listened, acknowledged, and returned the conversation to the question Newsom couldn't answer. Trump closed the 3 folders he'd used. He placed them in a stack to his left. In front of him now was only a single sheet of paper. He didn't slide it across. He looked at Newsom for the first extended look of the meeting. Governor, we've talked about $24 billion you can to count for. Trump summarized. We've talked about a 2-2-year pledge you didn't keep. We've talked about 9 days you weren't in your own state while it was burning. I want to ask you about something different now. Not a policy question, not a budget question, a character question. Newsom straightened in his chair. For a moment, he saw an opening. Character questions were, in his political self-assessment, his strongest territory. He was considered handsome. He was considered articulate. Profile writers at The New Yorker and The Atlantic had, over 15 years, used the same adjective to describe him, thoughtful. He'd cultivated a capacity to speak about his own character on demand in ways that audiences found persuasive. Please, Mr. President, Newsom invited the inquiry. November 6, 2020. Do you remember where you were? Trump asked. The opening closed. Every person in the Oval Office knew. Every person watching the pool clip when it aired 3 days later would know. The answer was public. The answer had been public for 6 years. The answer had become, in the political vernacular of both parties, shorthand for a particular kind of hypocrisy. Mr. President, I've addressed the French Laundry incident multiple times. Publicly, Newsom responded defensively. Governor, I didn't ask whether you'd addressed it. I asked whether you remembered it. Trump corrected. Yes, Mr. President, I remember. For the camera? Governor? Where were you? Trump pushed. At a dinner, Mr. President. In Yountville, California. At a restaurant. What was the name of the restaurant, Governor? The French Laundry. How many people were at your table? Approximately 12, Mr. President. Approximately 12. And at that time, Governor, what had you, 2 days earlier, instructed Californians to do regarding Thanksgiving gatherings? Trump asked steadily. Pause. ID issued guidance encouraging Californians to limit gatherings to members of their own household. Newsom answered softly. Limit, Governor? Trump challenged. I have your exact language in front of me, your press office statement, November 4th, 2020. Quote, gatherings with individuals outside your immediate household should occur. This isn't a suggestion. This is guidance grounded in public health imperatives. Californians who violate this guidance are putting the lives of their neighbors at risk. End quote. Trump placed the paper down. Governor, 2 days after issuing that statement, which called gatherings not a suggestion and accused Californians who violated it of putting lives at risk, you attended a dinner for 12 at a Michelin 3-starred restaurant with lobbyists. The photograph of the table was taken by another diner and published. I have the photograph. He didn't show the photograph. He didn't need to. Every American over the age of 35 had seen it. Governor, you told California families they couldn't gather with their own parents for Thanksgiving. And 2 days later, you dined with lobbyists, Trump pointed out. Mr. President, I've apologized for that incident multiple times, Newsom insisted. Governor, I didn't ask for an apology, Trump replied coldly. I asked a question. The question is this. When you told Californians that gathering with their own families was putting lives at risk, did you believe it? Newsom paused. Mr. President, the public health guidance at the time reflected the best available scientific understanding of. Governor, did you believe it? Trump demanded. The words you said, when you said them. Did you, Gavin Newsom, believe that a California family gathering for Thanksgiving was putting lives at risk? A long silence followed. I believed the guidance was necessary, Mr. President, Newsom finally offered. That's not what I asked, Governor. Did you believe the words you said? The silence that followed was 14 seconds long. The pool camera audio engineer in the control booth in the lower level of the West Wing watched the silence meter climb. He didn't cut away. He didn't cover the pause with a studio transition. He let it run. It was, he'd tell his wife that night over dinner at their apartment in Arlington, the most effective silence he'd permitted to run in 17 years of pool production work. The guidance reflected. Newsom tried again. Governor, you can't answer the question, Trump stated. Trump leaned back slightly in the chair behind the resolute desk. Governor, I'm going to tell you why this matters. Not for my personal satisfaction, not for political points, because I am about to decide whether to sign a $40 billion federal disaster declaration, and in order to make that decision, I have to assess whether the words you're retelling me today in this room about accountability and outcomes and the need for federal-state partnership, I have to assess whether you believe the words you're saying, or whether, like the words you said to Californians about Thanksgiving in 2020, they what you need to say to get what you want. Governor, I can sign a $40 billion declaration based on words from a man who can, in this Oval Office, answer the question of whether he believed his own guidance to his own constituents during a public health emergency. I need you to understand that, not as politics, as administrative reality. Newsom didn't speak. Trump waited 18 seconds, longer than any silence in the meeting so far. He wasn't pressing. He was simply giving Newsom the full opportunity to respond before moving on. The 18 seconds the pool camera would show were the clearest summary of the meeting's dynamic. Trump didn't need to fill space. Trump could wait. The waiting was its own instrument. Finally, Trump added one more thing quietly. "Governor, I want to add one sentence because it matters for the decision I'm about to make. In November of 2020, while you were at dinner at the French Laundry with lobbyists, a grandmother in Bakersfield named Rosalinda Mendoza didn't attend her grandson's 8th birthday party. Her daughter had asked her not to come. Her daughter had cited your guidance. Rosalinda Mendoza suffered a fatal medical emergency on Christmas Eve of that year. She hadn't seen her grandson since August." "Governor, I didn't know Rosalinda Mendoza," Trump clarified. "I'm not using her for a political point. I'm telling you her name because her daughter wrote to my White House Correspondence Office in December of 2024, shortly after I was elected. The letter is on file. The daughter wrote the letter because she's seen, for the 4th time that year, the photograph of your table at the French Laundry reposted on social media. The daughter asked one question in her letter. I'll read it to you." He read, quote, "Mr. President-elect, I'm writing to ask you something. I can't ask Governor Newsom because his office won't respond to my letters. My mother passed away, believing she was protecting my son. She believed this because Governor Newsom told her to believe this. 2 days after Governor Newsom told her to believe this, he went to dinner with 12 people at a restaurant. I've spent 4 years trying to understand how to explain this to my son. He's 12 now. He still asks about his grandmother. What do I tell him?" Trump placed the letter down. "Governor, I don't have an answer for her. I'm not going to invent one, but I'm telling you her story because, in about 10 minutes, I'm going to make a decision about $40 billion, and the decision will be informed, in part, by my assessment of the character of the man requesting it. The character question isn't an abstraction, Governor. It has names. Rosalinda Mendoza is one of them." Newsom's eyes moved. For the first time in the meeting, to the floor. He didn't look up for 7 seconds. When he looked up, he said only, I am sorry for her family's loss, Mr. President. I know you are, Governor. That is part of the problem, Trump replied. Mr. President, you're sorry for her family's loss. And you were sorry when it was politically damaging in 2020, and you'll be sorry at the next funeral in California that I'll hear about from a grieving relative who'll write to this office because yours won't respond. You are, Governor, genuinely and repeatedly sorry. What you aren't is accountable, and those aren't the same thing. Trump closed all the folders. The resolute desk was empty now, except for his hands and the single sheet of paper he hadn't slid across during round 4. He looked at Newsom for a full 10 seconds before speaking. The pool camera held on the tableau, President at desk, Governor in the Chesterfield chair, the gold curtains in soft focus behind them, the Oval Office at its particular March afternoon stillness. Governor, I want to be clear about what's going to happen, so that there's no ambiguity, and so that your staff, when you brief them in the car on the way to the airport, has an accurate record of this conversation, Trump instructed. Newsom nodded tight. I'm going to sign a federal disaster declaration for California, Trump announced. Not the one you requested. A different one. The amount will be $12 billion, not 43. Newsom's face showed, for the first time in the 4 1-minute meeting. A visible reaction. It lasted less than half a second. 12 billion. Approximately 28 cents on every requested dollar. The 12 billion will be structured as follows, Trump dictated. 6 billion will be direct aid to the affected California counties, bypassing state administration entirely. I want this money to reach the people whose homes were destroyed, not your home key successor agencies, not your continuum of care contractors, not your State Department of Housing Administration, county governments, which I trust to be closer to the ground than your administration has been for the last 3 years. 3 billion will be allocated to FEMA for direct administration, under federal supervision, federal comptroller oversight of every single disbursement. Quarterly reports to Congress. Financial misconduct reviews by the Department of Justice, if any is found. 3 billion will be conditional, released only upon completion by your administration of a full public accounting of the prior 24 billion in homelessness spending. The accounting must be audited by a federal inspector general's office, not a state auditor. If the accounting isn't completed within 12 months, the 3 billion returns to the general federal treasury. Trump paused. Governor, you came here today to ask for $43 billion without accountability. I'm offering you $12 billion with accountability. If you accept, sign here. He slid a single document across the table. It was the executive order, pre-drafted, bearing the White House seal, with a signature line for Newsom to countersign as the receiving state's executive, and a signature line for Trump immediately below. If you refuse, Governor, I'll issue a federal emergency supplemental through existing FEMA statutory authority at approximately $4 billion, with no state consultation. Trump finalized. That option doesn't require your signature. Governor, your choice. Newsom looked at the document. He'd been in the Oval Office for 41 minutes. He'd answered 3 of the questions he'd been asked, with direct evasions. He'd answered 4 more with extended silences. He hadn't managed, at any point in the conversation, to redirect the discussion to the territory he'd prepared. He picked up the pen. He read the executive order text. His eyes moved across the conditions, the accounting requirement, the county direct disbursement, the federal inspector general oversight. Then, without looking up, he signed. Trump took the document, signed his own name on the line immediately below Newsom's, and handed the document to Susie Wiles. She filed it in an archival folder and placed the folder on a small side table. Governor, California will receive $12 billion in federal disaster assistance, Trump declared. The accounting requirement on the final $3 billion is in effect as of today. My chief of staff will be in communication with yours regarding the specific federal audit protocols. Trump stood. It was the first time he'd stood during the entire meeting. Governor, I hope your administration finds where the $24 billion went. For your sake, and for the sake of the people of California. He didn't extend a hand. He walked to the private door on the east side of the Oval Office, the door that led to the corridor connecting to his private dining room and the Chief of Staff's office. He didn't look back. He didn't wait for Newsom to leave first. The door closed behind him. Susie Wiles held open the Oval Office door on the opposite side, the door through which Newsom had entered 43 minutes earlier. Governor, your motorcade is ready, she informed him. Newsom stood. He didn't speak. He walked out. The pool camera captured the final frame of the meeting. The Resolute desk empty, the folders stacked and gone. The Oval Office still. The pool camera footage from the Oval Office meeting was released by the White House Correspondents Association, per standard protocol, 48 hours after the meeting concluded. The released package was a 10-minute edited selection chosen by the pool producer on rotation. It didn't include the full 3 hours of ambient footage that the camera had captured. It included, specifically, the moment Newsom's hand rose to his jacket cuff during round 3. It included the 1-4-second silence before Newsom couldn't answer the French Laundry question during round 4. It included the final frame of the empty Oval Office. Within 72 hours, the full 10-minute clip had been viewed 91 million times across platforms. The hashtag number 24billion trended for 118 consecutive hours. It was the longest political trending event on X since 2022. The pattern was consistent across user posts. A photograph of a homeless encampment in a California city, typically Sacramento or Los Angeles or San Francisco, accompanied by a screenshot of Newsom's public 2023 announcement framing HomeKey as a national model. A waitress in Sacramento named Deborah Alvarez posted a photograph of her monthly rent receipt alongside Newsom's $24 billion figure, with the caption, "It is the math that doesn't work." The post collected 3.4 million likes in 48 hours. Alvarez was contacted by a Newsom staff member for comment. She didn't respond. She was, 3 weeks later, offered a book deal by Simon & Schuster. She declined. She continued to work at the diner on Fulton Avenue, where she'd worked for 11 years. The cuff, the 0.7-second moment the pool camera had captured during Trump's question about Cal Fire Chief Morales, became the most widely shared political reaction template in TikTok history. Users applied the clip to personal moments of realization that they'd been caught. The clip accumulated 143 million views in 90 days. A behavioral psychology graduate student at UC Berkeley published a viral thread analyzing the micro-expression. Her most shared sentence, "This isn't nervousness. This is the precise moment a politician realizes that his strategy has ended." Newsom's Wikipedia page gained a new subsection under controversies titled Oval Office Meeting, March 2026. Within 1 week, the subsection was longer than the French Laundry subsection. Wikipedia editors didn't revert it. The citations were too dense and too mainstream. The California State Auditor's Office, pursuant to the federal accounting requirement attached to the $12 billion disaster declaration, opened the most comprehensive audit of state homelessness spending in California history. The audit scope covered fiscal years 2019 through 2026. The first findings, released 4 months into the audit process, identified $3.1 billion in state expenditure for which no disbursement records existed. The finding was reported on page A1 of the Sacramento Bee, under the headline, "Where the Money Went, Nobody Knows." The California State Legislature, responding to the audit findings, passed Assembly Bill 293, the homelessness transparency legislation Newsom had vetoed in September of 2024, with veto-proof majorities in both the Assembly and the Senate. Newsom signed it without ceremony. No press release was issued. No reporters were invited. The United States Department of Housing and Urban Development Office of Inspector General opened a federal compliance review of California's use of federal emergency housing voucher funds between fiscal years 2021 and 2026. The review wasn't a formal investigation. It was, however, the first federal-level inquiry into California homelessness spending in 22 years. The Los Angeles Times, in collaboration with the investigative nonprofit Cal Matters, published a 4-part investigative series over the following 18 months, titled The Missing Billions. The series won the Pulitzer Prize for Public Service the year after publication concluded. Newsom declined every interview request during the reporting period. His former San Francisco chief of staff, whose 2013 memorandum had been read into the Oval Office record in March of 2026, did agree to one on-the-record interview. The final paragraph of that interview, which ran on the series' last day, would become the most quoted sentence of the entire Pulitzer-winning investigation. He always believed the sentence when he said it, the chief of staff noted. He believed it. That was his gift and his problem. He was the last person in the room to know a promise had become a lie. California Republican state legislators introduced legislation months after the Oval Office meeting to require mandatory quarterly gubernatorial presence at sites of active state emergencies. The legislation was named the Cal Fire Presence Act, in reference to Chief Morales' January 2026 email. It didn't pass, but it was introduced, and it was, for the first time in modern California political memory, the subject of bipartisan discussion. Gavin Newsom announced his 2028 presidential campaign on April 14, 2027, 13 months after the Oval Office meeting. The announcement event was held at the San Francisco Ferry Building. The crowd was smaller than his 2018 gubernatorial kickoff had been. His announcement speech was 61 minutes long. It didn't mention homelessness. It didn't mention California as federal audit. It didn't mention the Oval Office meeting. Democratic primary polling conducted by 5 major outlets in the 2 weeks following the announcement placed Newsom fourth in a 9-candidate Democratic primary field. He'd been considered 18 months earlier the presumptive frontrunner for the nomination. The polling narrative across all 5 outlets converged on a single phrase, repeated in varying forms by focus group participants across demographic categories. He didn't have an answer. The Democratic National Committee, in quiet strategic conversations that leaked to Axios by October of 2027, concluded that Newsom had become structurally unviable for a general election. The word structurally was the word that circulated through Democratic campaign strategist circles for months afterward. It meant, in plain English, that no amount of additional media strategy could repair what the Oval Office pool camera had captured. Newsom withdrew from the Democratic primary on February 4, 2028, 4 days before the New Hampshire primary. His withdrawal statement was 2,100 words long. It didn't mention the Oval Office meeting. It mentioned 3 separate times, a phrase that would follow him for the remainder of his political career: the need to refocus on the state that elected me. California inaugurated a new governor in January of 2028. The new governor, a Democrat, inherited the federal audit process. By the middle of 2029, her administration had released a 340-page comprehensive accounting of the $24 billion. 14 federal inquiries emerged from the accounting. 2 former Newsom administration officials were charged with federal financial violations. Both accepted responsibility within 9 months of being charged. Newsom himself wasn't charged. No evidence emerged linking him personally to the mismanaged disbursements. His offense, as the Sacramento Bee would write in an editorial titled "The Administrative Failure," was administrative rather than legal. He didn't misappropriate the money. The editorial concluded he simply couldn't tell anyone where it went, and in the end, that was worse. 4 years after the Oval Office meeting, a former senior staff member who served in both Newsom's San Francisco mayoralty and his California governorship, was asked by a reporter from Politico magazine, off the record, what she thought had happened in Washington on that March morning in 2026. She thought about the question for a long time. Then she said, "He walked in, thinking it was a press conference. He walked out realizing it had been a deposition." The pool camera footage, which had been released to the American public that week, in March of 2026, remained in the National Archives. It would be studied in the decade that followed by political science graduate students, by White House communications staff of both parties, and by speechwriters preparing heads of state for meetings they couldn't afford to lose. It would be studied because it had demonstrated a simple truth that had been forgotten in the decade preceding it. The truth was that performance only works when the other party agrees to perform. Donald Trump, that March morning in the Oval Office, hadn't agreed, and the hair, for all its careful grooming, hadn't been the instrument the governor had needed.